sammā-samādhi. Last time, you watched jhana from outside the path, through flow research, through neuroscience, through the phenomenology of what absorption feels like when it happens, what your mind does when self-monitoring drops away, when the inner critic falls silent, when the cool, clear field opens behind ordinary awareness. We took jhana as a phenomenon, a state of consciousness, examined the way a phenomenon is examined. From the outside, we left a question hanging open, one you may still be carrying: the mind's capacity for absorption when trained deliberately, trained toward what exactly? Tonight, we come from a different vantage point, not from outside, looking in at a state, from inside the path, looking at what the path itself says jhana is for, not what jhana feels like, what it is, what the canon says it does, and where it leads. That is a different question, and it has a different kind of answer. Phenomenology can describe what happens when concentration deepens. Only the path can say what concentration is for. The eighth factor of the Noble Eightfold Path, right concentration, sammā-samādhi, was defined by the Buddha in 3 separate suttas with identical wording. That repetition matters. Across the entire Pali Canon, this exact formula appears each time sammā-samādhi is defined, not paraphrased, not summarized. The same words in the same order 3 times. The definition is not approximate. It is precise, and here it is. And what, monks, is right concentration? There is the case where a monk, quite secluded from sensuality, secluded from unskillful qualities, enters and remains in the first jhana, rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. With the stilling of directed thoughts and evaluations, he enters and remains in the second jhana, rapture and pleasure born of concentration, unification of awareness free from directed thought and evaluation, internal assurance. With the fading of rapture, he remains equanimous, mindful, and alert, and senses pleasure with the body. He enters and remains in the third jhana, of which the noble ones declare, equanimous and mindful, he has a pleasant abiding. With the abandoning of pleasure and pain, as with the earlier disappearance of elation and distress, he enters and remains in the fourth jhana, purity of equanimity and mindfulness, neither pleasure nor pain. This, monks, is called right concentration. That is the definition. Not deep focus, not meditative calm, not access concentration, not mindful presence, not the open monitoring of body and breath, not the bare attention that has become the public face of contemplative practice in the modern West. The 4 jhanas, in order. You might be tempted to read past that and assume the precision is technical, a matter for scholars and translators, not for anyone trying to understand what sammā-samādhi actually means in their own practice or their own life. But this precision is not gatekeeping. It is description. The canon is describing a specific training that produces specific results. If the training is vaguely defined, the results are vaguely expected, and the results the canon has in mind, as we will see, are not vague at all. They are the difference between a mind that can be turned toward liberation and a mind that cannot. There are real stakes in this. If sammā-samādhi turns out to mean any reasonably focused state, then the 8th factor of the Noble Eightfold Path is something most serious meditators have already touched. If it means something more demanding and something more specific, then the path the Buddha actually described is something narrower, and what most practice today is something else, perhaps adjacent to the path but not quite it. That is the question this video is finally going to take seriously. So we begin where the Buddha began, with what the path actually says about its own eighth factor. 3 suttas, identical wording, the 4 jhanas. But that is the definition, not the destination. A definition tells you what a thing is. It does not tell you what it is for. And the Buddha was equally precise about that. Chapter 1, The 4 Purposes. The 4 jhanas. That is the platform. But the Buddha did not define sammā-samādhi and then leave its function unstated. In AN 441, he names 4 purposes, 4 developments of concentration, each leading somewhere different. Listen to what he says. Monks, these are the 4 developments of concentration. Which 4? There is the development of concentration that, when developed and pursued, leads to a pleasant abiding in the here and now. There is the development of concentration that, when developed and pursued, leads to the attainment of knowledge and vision. There is the development of concentration that, when developed and pursued, leads to mindfulness and alertness. There is the development of concentration that, when developed and pursued, leads to the ending of the effluence. 4 purposes: pleasant abiding, knowledge and vision, mindfulness and alertness, the ending of the effluence. The first sounds modest, the last sounds like the entire goal of the path. And in a sense, it is. Listen to how the Buddha describes that 4th purpose in full. There is the case where a monk remains focused on arising and falling away with reference to the 5 clinging aggregates. Such is form, such its origination, such its passing away. Such is feeling, such is perception. Such are fabrications, such is consciousness, such its origination, such its disappearance. This is the development of concentration that, when developed and pursued, leads to the ending of the effluence. The ending of the effluence, the taints of sensuality, of becoming, of ignorance, the deepest currents of the mind that drag it back into suffering again and again. That is the 4th purpose of jhana. There is a temptation, hearing those 4, to assume only the first one involves jhana in the strict sense, that the deeper purposes belong to some other kind of concentration, some other practice, something more refined than what was just defined in SN 45.8. Thanissaro Bhikkhu addresses this directly in a footnote, and the footnote is decisive. It is sometimes argued that the first development of concentration is the only one that falls under the 4 jhanas, but the passages cited in these notes all show that jhana is involved in all 4 developments. The difference lies in how the practice of jhana is used. All 4, not different forms of concentration for different purposes. The same jhana applied differently. The first purpose uses it as refuge. The second uses it as the base for higher knowledge. The third uses it to sharpen mindfulness in everyday experience. The 4th uses it as the platform from which insight ends suffering. This is the architectural key to the whole video. Jhana is not a destination. It is a platform. What is done from it determines where the path goes. Start with the first purpose: pleasant abiding in the here and now. It can sound like a side benefit, a perk of meditation, the reward for sitting still long enough. And it is pleasant. There is no question about that. Anyone who has touched even the threshold of jhana knows the kind of quiet that opens up when the mind genuinely stills. But the Buddha did not include pleasant abiding among the 4 developments of concentration because it is a perk. He included it because, without it, the path does not move. MN 13 makes the point directly. Even a meditator who can see clearly the drawbacks of sensuality, who understands that chasing pleasant experiences leads to disappointment, that the pursuit of stimulation is endless and ultimately unsatisfying. Even such a meditator, if he cannot reach the pleasure of at least the first jhana or something higher, will be drawn back to sensuality. Thanissaro states it cleanly. Even though you may have a right understanding about the drawbacks of sensuality, if you don't have access to the kind of pleasure and rapture that jhana can provide, you're always going to be tempted to go back. So mere insight on its own isn't enough. You cannot give up a lesser pleasure without a greater one to replace it. That sentence is worth sitting with, because it is not a moral statement. It is a structural observation about how the human mind works. The path is not asking for cold renunciation. It is not asking you to accept deprivation as the price of wisdom, to grind through years of grim discipline while the world keeps offering pleasures you have decided to refuse. The path that asks for that frames the spiritual life as a slow starvation, is not the path the Buddha described. He had tried that path himself for 6 years before he found the rose apple memory we will come to in chapter 3. He nearly died on that path. He left it deliberately and never returned. What the Buddha offered instead was something specific, a form of pleasure that is more refined, more stable, and not subject to the endless hunger of craving. A pleasure that does not depend on the world giving you anything. A pleasure available, at least in its first form, to anyone willing to do the work of seclusion and stillness. And that pleasure has a name, jhana. AN 763 makes the image explicit. The 7 good qualities of a noble disciple: conviction, shame, compunction, learning, persistence, mindfulness, and discernment, are compared to the structural defenses of a fortress. The walls, the moats, the watchtowers, the trained soldiers holding the perimeter, and the 4 jhanas, they are the stores of food inside the fortress, the provisions that keep the soldiers fed while they hold the walls. Without the food, the soldiers leave. Without jhana, the path collapses back into the world it was trying to step out of. This is why the first purpose matters. Pleasant abiding is not decoration, it is nourishment, the food that makes the path possible. The second purpose, knowledge and vision, uses jhana as the base for higher faculties. The luminous mind of the 4th jhana becomes the platform from which the meditator can incline toward extraordinary perception. This is the territory of the divine eye, of the recollection of past lives, of the knowledges the Buddha himself developed on the night of his awakening. We will return to that in chapter 3. The third purpose, mindfulness and alertness, uses jhana differently still. Here the practice supports the development of fully present awareness, the kind of clear attention that does not collapse under the weight of feeling and thought as they arise and pass. The concentrated mind in this development lends its steadiness to mindfulness in everyday experience. Each of these uses the same 4 jhanas. Each uses them differently. This is what Thanissaro's footnote was protecting against. The misreading that would make jhana useful only for the first purpose, pleasant abiding, and then assume the deeper purposes need some other tool, some other practice, some other concentration not yet defined. There is no other concentration. There are 4 uses of one platform. Now return to the 4th purpose, the ending of the effluence, the same jhana, but used differently. The concentrated mind is turned toward the 5 clinging aggregates: form, feeling, perception, fabrications, consciousness, the 5 layers of what we ordinarily mistake for a self. And the concentrated mind watches their arising, their passing, their dependence on conditions, such as form, such its origination, such its passing away. The pattern, applied across all 5 aggregates, witnessed not as belief, but as direct seeing. Because the mind doing the watching is jhana stabilized, the watching is not interrupted by craving for the next moment or aversion to this one. The watching can stay long enough to actually see. This is the use of jhana that ordinary attention cannot replicate. The unconcentrated mind looking at form, at feeling, at perception will lose the thread within seconds. It will get pulled into a memory, into a plan, into a pang of hunger or discomfort. It cannot sustain the witnessing long enough for the aggregates to actually show themselves as they are. The jhana-stabilized mind can. That is its work in the 4th purpose. Not generating insight from outside, providing the stable platform on which insight is finally able to land and hold. The mind is concentrated. The aggregates are watched. The effluence, sensuality, becoming, ignorance, fade. So the same jhana serves the trembling beginner who needs a refuge from the world's pull, and the arahant who has just ended birth. The same platform, different applications. This is what AN 441 means by developments of concentration. Not different types of concentration for different stages. 4 uses of one platform. The platform is the 4 jhanas. The applications are what the path becomes. And every one of them, every single one, operates from that platform, not somewhere beyond it, not in a different room, from it. Which raises the question we have been circling. If jhana is the platform, and the 4 purposes are what gets done from it, what exactly is the structure of from? When the suttas describe liberation arising in the wake of jhana, are they describing something that happens inside deep absorption, or something that happens because of deep absorption? Something done from the platform, not within it. That distinction sounds technical. It is not. It is the difference between the path the Buddha actually described and a path that quietly substitutes one thing for another. The canon, as we will see in chapter 3, is unmistakably clear about which one it means. Before we can answer it, though, we have to deal with a controversy that has been running among serious teachers for decades. A controversy about what jhana even is, because if we cannot agree on the platform, the rest of the conversation cannot begin. Chapter 2, the jhāna-lite controversy. We arrive at a place where serious, accomplished teachers disagree about what jhana actually is, about what counts as first jhana and what counts as the threshold leading to it, about whether the modern descriptions of jhana are faithful to the canon or quietly redefining it. This is not an academic dispute. It is a practical one. Because if what the suttas call right concentration is more accessible than the Visuddhimagga suggests, then the path opens to many more people than has been assumed. And if it requires more than some modern teachers suggest, then the path is more demanding. And the practice most students take to be sammā-samādhi may be something else, something earlier, something that has not yet quite become the platform the Buddha was pointing toward. The stakes are real, so let me map 4 positions, honestly, without strawmanning any of them. There is genuine disagreement here, and pretending otherwise, flattening one side into a caricature so the other can win, does not serve anyone. 4 positions. At the deep end stands Ajahn Brahm, in the Thai forest lineage of Ajahn Chah, together with the Pa-Auk tradition of Burma. The view here is that jhana, true jhana, as the suttas describe it, is an extraordinary state of absorption, far removed from ordinary consciousness. Entry requires a nimitta, a counterpart sign, an internally perceived mental light that the meditator gradually stabilizes and merges into. Once true jhana is entered, the 5 physical senses shut off entirely. The body disappears from awareness. The capacity for deliberate choice vanishes. The meditator does not move, does not decide, does not direct attention. Concentration has become so total that the ordinary apparatus of perception and choice has fallen away. In his teachings on the hindrances, Ajahn Brahm has put it directly. The body disappears and the 5 senses all switch off. The Pa-Auk tradition holds a similar high bar, often even more demanding, with extensive kasina practice. The use of physical objects, like a colored disc, as the basis for developing the nimitta. By this standard, the lighter meditative states described by other teachers and experienced by most serious practitioners are not jhana. They are access concentration, upacāra-samādhi, the threshold leading to the door, not the room itself, real, valuable, worth developing, but not yet what the canon calls sammā-samādhi. That is the deep end, stated honestly. At the other end stands Lee Brasington, an American teacher in the lineage of Ayakema, and the meditation scholar Richard Shankman. Brasington coined the distinction that defines this position. He calls his approach sutta-style jhanas, in contrast to what he calls Visuddhimagga-style jhanas. His exact words, sutta-style jhanas, do not require a nimitta and involve more accessible states of concentration. He does not apologize for this. He does not call it a lesser version. He openly embraces what others have dismissively called jhāna-lite and argues with citations from the texts themselves that the jhanas described in the 5th century commentaries and replicated in much of modern teaching bear only a distant resemblance to what the Buddha was originally pointing toward. This is not a casual claim. Brasington has spent decades on it. He teaches jhana to practitioners who could not access the Brahm or Pa-Auk version no matter how hard they tried, and his students report stable, repeatable absorption experiences. Without the nimitta, without sensory shutdown, but with all 4 jhanas described in their canonical sequence. Richard Shankman, in his careful study, The Experience of Samadhi, documents 2 distinct jhana systems within the Pali literature itself, the Sutta tradition and the Visuddhimagga tradition. He declines to declare either wrong. Both, he argues, are coherent within their own framework. The question is not which one is correct in some absolute sense, but which one the Buddha was actually describing in the 4 Nikāyas. That is the light end, also stated honestly. And then there is Thanissaro Bhikkhu in the Kamathana lineage of Ajahn Lee. His position is not a compromise between the 2 ends. It is genuinely different from both. Against the deep end, Thanissaro rejects the nimitta requirement. He rejects the 5 senses shut off reading. He rejects the kasina-based methods. None of these, he argues, have a clear basis in the 4 Nikāyas. They are commentarial additions, descriptions developed in later centuries, projected back onto a canon that does not describe them. But against the light end, he insists on actual jhana, not a modicum of concentration, not a relatively calm state arising from bare awareness practice. Real absorption, with the qualities the suttas specifically describe: rapture, pleasure, unification of awareness, the fading of one quality at each transition, and the emergence of the next. His anchor is the language of the suttas themselves. AN 528 describes the first jhana with a remarkable simile. The meditator's whole body is pervaded by rapture and pleasure, so that there is nothing of his entire body unpervaded, not most of the body, not a kind of subtle, abstract body awareness, the entire physical body suffused with the qualities of jhana, This single phrase, nothing of his entire body unpervaded, is the canonical basis for rejecting the senses shut off, body disappears reading. If the body has disappeared from awareness, how can the meditator know that jhana pervades it? The simile only works if body awareness is retained, so Thanissaro's jhana is genuinely absorbed, but the body is still there. The meditator is still aware, still able to perceive what is happening. The mind has gone deep, but it has not gone unconscious. His reading of the canonical phrase secluded from sensuality is consistent with this. He does not read it as sensory cutoff. He reads it as seclusion from passion for sensual thoughts and plans, from the active pulling toward experience that ordinarily fragments attention. The senses are not shut down. The interest in chasing sensory pleasure has gone quiet, and his reading of the first jhana factors, vitakka and vicara, directed thought and evaluation, is equally distinctive. He sees them as an active process. The meditator deliberately works rapture and pleasure through the body as a whole, evaluating the results as the practice proceeds. Like the canon's image of the bathman kneading bath powder, water added drop by drop, the entire ball saturated, no part left dry. Jhana, in this reading, is not a state that descends on a passive observer. It is a state that the meditator is participating in, helping to shape, working through the body deliberately. This is real jhana, but it is not the jhana of the deep end, and it is something more than the jhana of the light end. Thanissaro is honest about the difficulty of telling, in practice, what one is in. You cannot really know at first, he writes. It does not come with a sign that says, now entering jhana. Only the fourth jhana has a definite signpost. The breath stops. SN 3611 and AN 1072 both confirm this. Until then, the meditator must work, evaluate, refine, develop the skill of knowing the state by its own qualities, without certainty from outside. That is Thanissaro's third position, distinct from both ends, anchored in the sutta's own language, now to a fact that, once stated clearly, changes the entire conversation. The technical term at the center of this debate, access concentration, upacāra-samādhi, is not in the four Nikāyas. It was coined by Buddhaghosa in the Visuddhimagga, the great 5th century systematization of Theravada doctrine. Composed roughly between 412 and 434 of the Common Era, roughly 1,000 years after the Buddha's death. This is not a contested point. Bhante Henepola Gunaratana, himself a rigorous Theravada scholar monk who began his practice in the strict Visuddhimagga tradition and evolved over decades toward the Sutta camp, has documented it directly. In his scholarship on the development of Buddhist meditation terminology, he writes that Buddhaghosa invented several key meditation terms not to be found in the suttas, and he names them: parikamma-samādhi, upacāra-samādhi, apana-samādhi, preliminary concentration, access concentration, absorption concentration, the three-stage map that defines so much of the modern controversy. None of these terms, in the form used today, appears in the four Nikāyas. This does not mean the controversy is fake. The substance of the debate, what is the threshold to jhana, what counts as the first jhana itself, is real. Different teachers describe different experiences and call them by different names, and the question of what the Buddha was actually describing matters enormously to anyone trying to walk the path he laid out. But the vocabulary of the debate is post-canonical. The dispute over whether some particular meditative state is access concentration or first jhana is being conducted in language the Buddha never used, projected back onto texts that simply say, sammā-samādhi is the 4 jhānas. That reframe is worth pausing on. The controversy is real. The vocabulary is 1,000 years younger than the texts the controversy is about, and it is worth noting precisely how Thanissaro himself handles this, because it would be easy to assume that he names access concentration and rules it out, that he stands up against the Visuddhimagga and declares the term illegitimate. He does not. His move is different and more rigorous. He defines what sammā-samādhi is, the 4 jhānas, in the sense the suttas specify, and he lets the definitions settle the matter. When he does use the phrase access concentration in his writings, he treats it neutrally, describing it as a developmental stage with a known weakness, namely that it cannot withstand pleasure without dissolving. He does not crusade against the term. He simply stays with what the canon actually says, and lets that close the door without slamming it. The major canonical evidence he points to is the same we have already heard. SN 45.8 defines sammā-samādhi as the 4 jhānas. AN 528 specifies that rapture pervades nothing of the body unpervaded, which requires actual whole-body absorption, not a lighter threshold state. The texts settle what they settle. The texts do not need to be defended against terms that did not exist when they were spoken. There is one related quote worth pausing over, because it has circulated widely in the jhana conversation, and it has often been used in ways its speaker did not intend. Ajahn Fuang, Thanissaro's own teacher, once said of a certain state encountered in meditation, "It is not even right concentration." This quote has sometimes been taken as a verdict on access concentration, as if Ajahn Fuang were declaring the threshold state ruled out of court, as if the Thai forest tradition itself were rejecting upacāra-samādhi by name. That is not what he meant. What Ajahn Fuang was describing was a different state altogether, a state of non-perception, asaññi bhava, sometimes called moha-samādhi, deluded concentration, a blanked-out absorption with no clarity, no investigation, no awareness of what is happening, a kind of mental fog that some meditators mistake for deep stillness because everything has gone quiet. But the quietness, in this case, is not the quietness of jhana. It is the quietness of a mind that has dimmed itself. That is what Ajahn Fuang was saying is not even right concentration. He was not talking about access concentration. He was talking about a blanked-out state. The distinction matters. Conflating them puts words in his mouth that he did not say. 4 positions. Genuine disagreement. A controversy that uses 5th century vocabulary to debate what 4th century BCE texts actually mean. Thanissaro's third way, anchored in the Sutta's own language, declining to declare a winner, but quietly settling the matter by sticking with what the canon describes. We do not need to resolve the controversy from outside. We need to do what the canon itself suggests. Take sammā-samādhi as defined, the 4 jhanas, and see where the path actually goes from there. Because the path does go somewhere. And the Buddha himself described the journey in his own words in the most extraordinary document we have about how he found his way home. He found it under a rose apple tree. Chapter 3, MN 36, From the Platform. The Buddha tells the story himself in MN 36, one of the most autobiographical suttas in the entire canon. He has been a wandering ascetic for 6 years. He has done what wandering ascetics do, and he has done it more thoroughly than most. He has restricted his food until his ribs stood out like the rafters of a derelict shed. He has held his breath until his ears rang, and his head felt as though it were being crushed. He has practiced every austerity the spiritual culture of his time had developed, and he has practiced them to the edge of his own death. And he has not found awakening. So he sits, weakened, near death. And a question arises, almost as a recollection more than a question. Could there be another path to awakening? In the wake of the question, a memory comes from his childhood, from years before he ever left his father's house. He had been sitting in the cool shade of a rose apple tree. His father, the Sakyan, was working nearby. There was no particular ambition in the moment, no spiritual project, no expectation of anything. He was a child sitting under a tree on a working day, and then quite secluded from sensuality, secluded from unskillful qualities. The first jhana arose, spontaneously, without effort, rapture and pleasure, born of seclusion, accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. The classical formula, exactly as the suttas would later define it. In a child, under a tree, with no instruction. Now, weakened and near death, the memory comes back. And a thought arises. Could that be the path to awakening? Then the answer comes as he tells it. That is the path to awakening. What made the memory significant, what made it return to him at that particular moment after years of pursuing the opposite kind of practice, was a single word: pleasure. The first jhana in that childhood moment had been pleasant, not the pleasure of sensuality, not the pleasure of accomplishment, a pleasure that had nothing to do with sensuality, nothing to do with unskillful qualities, a pleasure that arose precisely because he was secluded from those things. For 6 years, he had been operating on the assumption that pleasure of any kind was the obstacle, that the path required leaving pleasure behind, that awakening would come through enduring more, refusing more, depriving more. He had tried that. He had nearly died trying. Now the question arises, so why am I afraid of that pleasure? That pleasure has nothing to do with sensuality, nothing to do with unskillful qualities. It is one of the most consequential questions in the history of religion, because it is the moment the Buddha sees that the path to awakening is not the path of extreme asceticism. It is the path of a different kind of pleasure, a pleasure that does not bind, does not depend, does not pull the mind back into craving, but stabilizes, deepens, makes possible everything the path will require from here. He takes solid food. The 5 monks who had practiced asceticism alongside him see this and leave in disgust. They think he has fallen back into luxury. They will not understand until much later, at Deer Park, after the awakening, what they had walked away from. And then alone, the Buddha enters the first jhana, and the second, and the third, and the fourth, in the order the suttas would later canonize. Exactly as the 8-factor path would later define right concentration. What happens next in MN 36 is the most important architectural detail in the entire video. After he reaches the 4th jhana, the Buddha does not stay there. He does something else. And the suttas describe it with a formula that is repeated 3 times, once before each of the 3 knowledges of the awakening, identical each time, word for word. Here it is. When the mind was thus concentrated, purified, bright, unblemished, rid of defilement, pliant, malleable, steady, and attained to imperturbability, I directed it to Listen to those qualities: pliant, malleable, steady. These are what the fourth jhana produces. A mind that does not resist. A mind that can be turned. A mind that holds whatever it is given to do without breaking, without slipping, without losing its edge. That is what the platform is for. And then the three most important words in this entire video. I directed it to. Not I rested in it. Not I dissolved into it. Not I entered a further absorption. I directed it to. The concentrated, purified, pliant mind, once it has been built, is then directed, turned, pointed, toward something. The awakening does not happen inside the fourth jhana. It happens when the mind that the fourth jhana has produced is finally aimed at the question it was made to answer. This is what from jhana, not in jhana, actually means. Jhana is the platform. The application is what is done from it. The I directed it to is the moment of application. And the suttas repeat the formula 3 times in MN 36 because the Buddha applied the platform 3 times to 3 different knowledges across 3 watches of one night. First watch of the night, he directs the mind to the recollection of past lives, and he sees them, many lives, many cycles, the vast extent of his own becoming. Second watch, he directs the mind to the passing away and re-arising of beings, the divine I. He sees beings dying and being reborn according to their actions, wholesome actions producing one kind of result, unwholesome actions producing another. The mechanics of karma, not as belief, but as direct seeing. Third watch, he directs the mind to the ending of the mental effluence, the third knowledge, the one that ends the path. Listen to how he describes it, in his own words, word for word. When the mind was thus concentrated, purified, bright, unblemished, rid of defilement, pliant, malleable, steady, and attained to imperturbability, I directed it to the knowledge of the ending of the mental effluence. I directly knew, as it had come to be, that this is stress. This is the origination of stress. This is the cessation of stress. This is the way leading to the cessation of stress. These are effluents. This is the origination of effluence. This is the cessation of effluence. This is the way leading to the cessation of effluence. My heart, thus knowing, thus seeing, was released from the effluent of sensuality, released from the effluent of becoming, released from the effluent of ignorance. With release, there was the knowledge released. I directly knew that birth is ended, the holy life fulfilled, the task done. There is nothing further for this world. Birth is ended, the holy life fulfilled, the task done. There is nothing further for this world. This is what sammā-samādhi is for. Not pleasant abiding in itself, though that was the first purpose. Not knowledge and vision in themselves, though those came in the first 2 watches. The ending of the effluence, the release of the heart from sensuality, from becoming, from ignorance, liberation, arising from a mind that jhana had made ready. Thanissaro is direct on this point. The path, he warns, is not itself the goal. And teachers who blur that distinction reveal something about what they themselves have not yet seen. Jhana is not the goal. The ending of suffering is the goal. Jhana is the platform from which the ending of suffering becomes possible. The food in the fortress, the stability of the mind, the pliancy and malleability that allows the mind to be directed where it has to be directed if the path is to arrive. That is the structure MN 36 demonstrates, not in commentary, not an interpretation, in the Buddha's own narrative of his own awakening. The platform, the direction, the release, in that order. And we have one more thing to see before this video ends. Chapter 4. The Circle. The Noble Path arc has been moving toward this, not just toward right concentration in itself, but toward what right concentration completes. In video number 44, we examined right effort, the calibration of energy, the lute string, not too tight, not too loose, the careful work of abandoning unskillful qualities and cultivating skillful ones, generating chanda, the desire to do that powers the path without binding it. In video number 46, we examined right speech, the training of the outer voice, then the inner voice, then finally the noble silence, Aryo Tunhi Bhavo, the silence the suttas associate with the second jhana, where directed thought and evaluation have fallen still. And now, in this video, right concentration. The deliberate cultivation of the concentrated mind that the noble silence was always pointing toward. The concentration group of the Noble Eightfold Path. Effort builds the energy. Speech trains the expression, outward and inward, until expression itself yields to silence. Concentration stabilizes the attention into the platform. 3 factors. 1. Preparation. But the path does not stop at right concentration. MN 117. The Mahakatar-Sakka Sutta, the Buddha's great discourse on the 40, describes how the path continues past its 8th factor. Listen to the formula. In one of right concentration, right knowledge comes into being. In one of right knowledge, right release comes into being. Thus the learner is endowed with 8 factors, and the arahant with 10. 8 for the one who is still on the path, 10 for the one who has arrived. Right concentration leads to right knowledge, leads to right release. This is what the platform of sammā-samādhi is moving toward, not a deeper concentration, not a more refined absorption. Sammā-jnana, right knowledge, the direct seeing that arises from the concentrated mind. And then sammā-vimutti, right release, the actual freeing of the heart from the effluence, as MN 36 described it, as the Buddha experienced it under the Bodhi tree. The 8-factor path is the path of the learner, the path of the one walking. The 10-factor path is the path completed. 8 factors that produce 2 more, the knowledge that ends the work and the release that follows. And here, at the end of this arc, something extraordinary happens. At the beginning, video number 32, we examined right view, the seed of the path, seeing clearly the nature of suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the way. Right view is where the 8-factor path begins, but right view, at the beginning, was held as conviction, as trust, as the orientation that gives the path its direction. The seeker had heard the 4 noble truths, had understood them with the mind, had accepted them as the framework worth investigating. That was right view as the first factor. At the end of the arc, here, at the end of right concentration, the path circles back, because the knowledge that arises from jhana in MN 36, the direct seeing of stress, of its origination, of its cessation, of the way leading to its cessation, is itself a form of right view. The same 4 noble truths the seeker began with, now seen directly, no longer believed, known. The right view that began the path returns at the end of the path, not as conviction, as realization. Right view began the journey, right concentration built the platform. Right knowledge arose from that platform. Right release completed the work. And the view that started everything is the view that finishes everything. The same view, transformed. Same view, transformed. This is why the path is best described not as a sequence, but as a circle. And not even as a circle, as a spiral. A loop returns to the same place. A spiral returns to the same place at a higher level. The path factors do not simply follow one another in linear order. They reinforce one another reciprocally. Right effort supports right mindfulness. Right mindfulness supports right concentration. Right concentration deepens the discernment that belongs to right view. And that deepened right view turns back, again, to refine right effort. The circle is not a trap. It is the architecture of growth. Each turn around takes the practitioner deeper, until eventually, as it did under the Bodhi tree, the spiral does not need another turn. The view has become realization. The release has occurred. The task is done. Sammā-samādhi, right concentration, defined by the Buddha as the 4 jhānas, precisely in 3 suttas, without ambiguity. A platform, not a peak. The nourishment that makes the path possible. The food in the fortress. The stability from which the ending of suffering can finally be seen clearly. The pliant, malleable, steady mind that can be directed where it needs to be directed. The last step the 8-factor path takes before it gives rise to the 2 factors that complete it. Right knowledge, right release, not a deeper concentration, not a more refined state. The ending of the effluence, the knowledge of release, the task done. That is what right concentration is for.